And it is the 8th of November. It has been 5 days since the election. And we are still here in limbo land. So today we will do Bible Prophecy lesson number 292. And today we'll start with the first two chapters of Joel. And then we'll review lesson 291. We got signs of the times, scripture of the day, and then we'll do Joel chapters 1 and 2. And so before we get started, we'll open with a word of prayer. Dean, open us with a word of prayer.
Just thank you, Heavenly Father, for this wonderful day, Lord. We're looking for a miracle, Heavenly Father, that Trump might be elected. We're just going to have faith in you, Lord, that we'll get whatever you'd like to have in office. We thank you for the privilege of learn more about your word, just guide and direct us. Speak through Carl. We might know more about you. This we fill you. He's going to be praying, amen.
Amen.
Trump will be victorious. I have no doubt.
You know, you've heard Pat Robertson say that the Lord told him that Trump was going to be reelected. I've heard another prophecy type guys telling us that Trump was going to be reelected. We have listened to our Rabbi Glazerton say he's looked in the equidistant letter sequence codes in the Bible, and in Genesis 15 it says Trump will be elected, re-elected.
He said he's going to be elected by, a lot of votes, so I don't know.
So the question is, are these guys all wrong?
No.
Only God knows.
Trump was elected. They just made it look like he wasn't.
What my suspicion is on all of this is that, when God is working in a situation, he usually doesn't go the direct route.
That's right.
And if you want to look at a few biblical examples, somebody tell me the story of Mordecai and Esther. Anybody remember that story?
Yeah.
Esther she spent a year getting groomed to go to, was it Vashti? And he had some other choice, but he chose Esther over her because he liked her better. And Esther saved her country from attack or from a war by making peace with this king. Is that briefly it?
Well, the part that I was interested in was Haman.
Well,
and how
Haman enough rope to hang himself when he hung himself.
Yeah, well, so what was the story between Haman and Mordecai?
What was her brother, husband, or brother?
Cousin or brother?
A relative of some sort. And then Haman, for some reason, which I don't remember, but he hated Mordecai. I think he was jealous, wasn't it? Wasn't it jealousy? And so Haman rigged up a deal to get Mordecai hanged. And as the story progresses, the king found out something about Haman's motives in this whole thing and was enraged. And Haman had created a gallows 50 cubits high to hang Mordecai on. And according to the story, Haman was hung on his own gallows along with his 7 sons. And so the point of the story was, right up till the moment the king learned of Haman's wicked ways, Mordecai was going to be hung.
Yeah.
And consequently, when God entered into the picture, he didn't enter in until the very last moment. And that required on the part of Esther and Mordecai an awful lot of faith, didn't it?
How about Daniel in the lion's den?
Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel got thrown into the lion's den. He was completely innocent of all the charges, yet he went into the lion's den and God stopped up the mouths of all of the lions. They didn't hurt him at all. But what happened to the adversaries of Daniel? Well, them and all their families got thrown in there and the lions dined on them. Now let's look at the case of Pharaoh. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, didn't he?
500
Went
years.
through 10 plagues. And finally, on the 10th plague, when the firstborn died, Pharaoh said, I'll get out of here. And so they did. But then what happened? Well, God changed his heart. And now Pharaoh decided, wait a minute, I'm not going to let them go. And he took his army and pursued them.
Right.
And they were already 3 days gone into the wilderness. And then they observed the armies of Pharaoh on the horizon coming. And there's nothing between that army and the children of Israel. And not only that, there was a branch of the Red Sea in front of them. They were caught. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go backward. They were toast.
No.
But Moses, if you'll recall, lifted his scepter and the sea parted. It was a miracle. In all these cases, you find that God...
What happened to Moses, Pharaoh and all his armies, they were drowned. Yeah.
Well, that was the point I was getting at. I guess I should have completed the sentence. But of course, I have my wife. She can complete my sentences for me.
You lucky guy.
She don't let me get away with anything.
You gotta get to the good point.
Yep, that's the good point.
That's the point.
So the point is, when God acts in these situations, it looks like there's despair and no hope. And to the carnal mind, there is no hope. You look at our situation right now, who is against us? Big tech, big media, just about big everything. Probably the CIA.
But why? But why?
Probably the judicial department.
But
And
why? Those people are so rich, like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg. I know they want it to be one world order, but why? Why?
well, the big picture here is we're at the end of the age, right? And we know from the Revelation account there is a one world government coming. It is being instigated by the powers of the air. Who runs the powers of the air? Satan. So this whole thing, as I have said before, we're in a battle between good and evil.
Oh, yeah.
This is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats. This is between God and his forces and Satan and his forces. Now, this is the way I see this thing coming to pass. Maybe I'm wrong, but this looks like the way God has acted in the past.
That's right.
We are right now at a point of despair because, well, everybody's against us. Who can be for us? Well, God is on our side, isn't he?
I think he's
Well-
testing our faith is what he's testing.
Isn't that the way it always works?
Yes.
He gets us right up to the edge of the Red Sea, and then he parts the water. I mean, it requires faith on our part. This is probably one of the best examples of practical faith that you'll come across. I'm not a preacher. I just teach Bible prophecy, and I don't claim to know much more. But I get frustrated when I hear preachers preaching about faith and trust and hope with never a practical example. Well, you're telling me to trust in the Lord and have faith in the Lord? Well, show me what that looks like, Well, we got an example right here. We can look to the future as the way God is going to order it with trust that he gets things done. Just like in all the cases that we talked about earlier. We can lean on his promises and we can expect him to act even though we're right up against the Red Sea. He's going to part the waters. And I anticipate that that's what's going to happen here. We're going to see an event very similar to parting the Red Sea here pretty quick. The number one reason I think so, because God is in control of everything. He put this guy, Trump, in this position for a reason. And Trump has a big ego, does he not?
Yeah, yes.
Is he likely to go away quietly?
No.
I don't think so. I mean, if he goes away, it ain't gonna be quietly, and they may very well have to drag him out of the White House.
Giuliani, his whole team, they're not gonna lay it down.
No, and so, my point is that when push comes to shove, Trump is going to be pushing and shoving. I don't know if you remember this or not, but when Nixon and Kennedy were running, the same thing happened. Kennedy won, not because he was the most popular, but because he had the biggest machine. The Duke of Duval County down here in Texas was so convinced that Kennedy was the right guy that he instructed all of the Braves in Duval County to get up and vote for Kennedy. And they did. And the same thing happened in Chicago. Consequently, Texas and Illinois went for Kennedy. Now, Nixon knew this, but he was not going to fight because he thought that it would tear the country apart if he did, and he submitted. Well, here we are these many years later. The same thing has happened, only it's much worse, orders of magnitude worse. And I think what we're going to see here is Trump fighting, prevailing, and those who performed the iniquity will be hung on their own gallows. So what we will do here is let's just act in faith that God is going to do this, and I'll guarantee you he will. He will do it. So we will see how this all works out. But my point is also not a time for despair. It's a time to act in faith, like the preachers have been telling us all these years, right?
Honestly, so we are the foot soldiers. You don't sit in a recliner and say, God's got this. You're his hands and feet on earth. You go out and you do and you say and you work it.
You bet. Well, we, like you say, we are just foot soldiers. We're not generals or lieutenants or anything, but we're down here on the ground pounding.
Well, Trump is going to. He will not concede. He will fight this to the end.
God made him that way.
God made him that way.
And,
It's
and
also in the whole plan to do that.
Exactly. I don't think God is finished with him. We need those peace treaties in the Middle East.
well, this is one of the biggest arguments I see for Trump being reelected, and that is there will be no peace treaty in the Middle East if Biden is in there because he don't care.
And he's going to rejoin the Paris Accord that
Oh yeah, he's gonna and tear down the wall that Trump built on the border and let all these people come in and completely destroy this country. That's the big
in
motive
6 months.
for the globalist. You can't have, pardon me, a strong United States of America and have a global one world government. It just ain't gonna work.
But the legals gonna vote Democratic anyway.
Well, absolutely, because they're gonna give them everything.
That's right.
They will bankrupt our country if it isn't already bankrupt. Okay, enough of my preaching. We'll get back into an area where I feel more comfortable. Reviewing lesson number 291. Well, this was Daniel chapter 12 and the first part of Hosea. And in Daniel chapter 12, we see Michael, the protecting angel of Israel, stepping aside and allowing this tribulation period to begin. And at that time, the angel that was reporting notes that the buried of the earth will rise, some for good and some for destruction. But the righteous will shine like stars in the firmament at that time. And we also know that Daniel, although he was given this prophecy directly from the angel, he did not understand it. And the angel said, well, that's because the words of this book are sealed until the end of the age. Here we said at the end of the age, and I can make an argument that we understand Daniel better than Daniel did, because Daniel was given the prophecy before the events even happened. So how could he know and understand what this prophecy was all about? He couldn't. Oh, well.
Sorry, I was trying to. Somebody sent
Who
me.
was that anyway?
Our
That's your
rhino.
boyfriend calling in?
That was our rhino, Chris Wallace.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, Carl.
Well,
to turn my.
Okay. The angel then stated that when Daniel asked the question, how long are these things going to be? And the angel said that there would be 1,290 days from the abomination of desolation until the end. We don't know what the end of what was, but till the end. And then he said, blessed are those that reach 1,335 days. Well, we know the abomination of desolation occurs at the 1,260th day of the tribulation period, because it's in the midst of the 7 years of weeks, or the 7 weeks of 360-day years. So when you add 1290 to that, you come up to the 10th day of the month following Tishri. And then if you add 45 days onto that to reach the 1335 days, you end up at the festival of Hanukkah, which is the rededication of the temple. So no doubt what the angel was conveying to Daniel was that after 1335 days, the temple is going to be rededicated, and this rededication process called Hanukkah is a 7-day event which basically duplicates the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's a very joyful time. So no doubt at this period of time, the temple will be rededicated, Christ will return, he will rule and reign out of that temple, and that will kick off the millennial reign. Now in Hosea, we got there, Hosea said there would be 2 days after the Lord returns to his place, and then in the 3rd day he would revive the nation of Israel. And from that we can conclude that Jesus left planet Earth in 33 AD. 2 days after that, or 2,000 years, because a day in the eyes of the Lord is 1,000 years, 2 days later, that puts us at 2033 AD. That's 2,000 years, and that's when he comes back. His feet set down on the Mount of Olives, and it cleaves in the middle. But you have to back up 7 years from that in order to get to the potential opportunities for the church to be raptured. There's nothing in the scripture that says the church has to be raptured on Rosh Hashanah before the Yom Kippur that the tribulation period begins. It could be years before that. My suspicion is it is right at the edge of the tribulation period, but could be earlier.
Is the Hebrew dates the same as ours as far as the days? They have like 7 days, or
Yes.
different, right?
Well, the difference in the Hebrew calendar and our calendar is that their calendar is a lunar-based calendar, and it's 360 days per year, which means 7 times every 19 years they have to add an additional month called V'Adar to make up the time, because otherwise, if you don't do that, eventually you're going to end up with Christmas in July.
Which
So-
calendar are you using?
Which calendar are we using?
The Hebrew calendar? No, but, I mean, when you study, which calendar?
Well, that's a good point. I'm using the solar calendar.
Okay.
So when he says 2 days, I'm using the solar, the solar, not the lunar calendar. So we'll see. The reason I'm not using the lunar calendar in this event is because if you did, 2 days from the time he left would have been about 50 years ago. It'd be a long time ago. So it apparently wasn't.
Yeah.
So it apparently wasn't using the lunar calendar. It's using the solar calendar. So, any questions about any of that stuff? The big reason that I threw in Hosea chapter 6 is because Hosea chapter 6 anticipates the return of the Lord some distant Rosh Hashanah from now, in the next 6 years. Maybe, and we will know when this event is going to happen, and by virtue of this peace treaty. That's what I'm looking for. We don't know when to look for the rapture until we see elements of peace coming together in the Middle East. And my feeling is the best representation of that covenant with the many is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that nuclear peace treaty that Kerry negotiated, if you want to call it a negotiation. He rolled over and played dead. Gave them everything they wanted and plus more. They didn't even sign the peace treaty, and they claimed they had one. Oh, it's ridiculous.
What about building a temple? Does that have to happen before
Nope. I think we will see the temple being built,
that? Okay,
but it doesn't necessarily have to be built.
okay.
And if they wanted to build a temple, they could build one in 90 days if they wanted to. Because they've got everything already prepared, yeah.
I remember reading a long time ago that they started counting the years over, like BC, AD, 2 or 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So these numbers, if you go, from he died at age 33, well, they didn't start counting over until a couple of years after he died.
There is a giant chronograph in the sky, which are the stars and the sun and the moon. And by virtue of knowing the positions of the sun and the moon and the stars, you can accurately determine how far back in history a certain event was.
Right.
And if you go back and look at the events surrounding the birth of Christ, for example, the alignment of the stars and the heavens and things, it's hard to miss the fact that his birth was being announced in 2 BC, and that his crucifixion, it's hard to miss the fact that there was a very interesting arrangement of stars on 33 AD during the Feast of Passover. So I am confident that we have the dates as right as we can get them. But once again, we are sitting here at the end of the age, and we know what to look for. If we're off by a year or two, we'll know, because we'll see this treaty with the many, with the Antichrist. And I got all my money on, Khomeini as the Antichrist, Ali Khamenei. I mean, how he fits just every criteria of the Scripture. So how can he not be? So that's, of course, that's my opinion. You're welcome to have your own. Any questions about any of this? Well, I guess class is over.
In the abomination of desolation, where somebody gets inside the temple and proclaims that they are God. Isn't that the abomination of desolation?
That's correct. The Antichrist will appear in the Holy of Holies, erect an image of himself, and declare himself to be God. He won't even claim that the Quran is the correct religious path. He's going to make up his own. He's going to have his own.
Oh, like the Pope.
Yeah, been known to happen. Okay, signs of the times. It's kind of not this time, but those of us who know Steve McQueen, he had a pretty raunchy life, but at the end, he became a Christian.
Yes.
He was the king of cool, but he died from cancer on November 7th, 1980 at 50 years old. And if you look at all of his memorabilia and everything, you find out that the guy was an adamant follower of Billy Graham at the end, and he became a Christian. And it goes to show you, what's the Scripture say, that those who are called at the 7th hour or the 8th hour of the day, they get the same prize as those of us who've been here all along. So old Steve McQueen is up there somewhere.
Yeah. Maybe Elvis too.
No, I'm pretty sure Elvis is up there.
Big Christian.
Yeah.
And then Kirk Cameron, he wrote he played in what was the movie he was in?
Left Behind series.
Yeah, the Left Behind series. He's warning us about socialism here. He says socialism and communism are knocking at our doors. Oh, surprise, surprise. So he's telling us all that we are non-essential in the eyes of this current government, and that even though 40 million inactive voters in the U.S. Should be working and in the November 3rd election, they may or may not, but hey, if we don't, who will? Yes.
Have you heard of Chris Christopherson?
Yeah, I heard of him.
Oh, he had a real good testimony.
Really?
In the church, and he became a Christian. He said, "There's no way he's going to walk up front," and he says, "You don't even remember when he got there, walked up there, and asked Christ coming to life to save him." Really good testimony.
Well, you see, now there's another candidate that I would have never suspected. You know, God's kind of interesting that way. He pulls these guys like Trump and Steve McQueen and Chris Christopherson, these guys that they just look like they have lived in the polar opposite of Christianity their entire life, but then something happens and they see the light.
Did you see that even the Amish voted this time? They had their carriages tripped.
Really?
Yeah, they had flags and Trump signs, and they
Well, isn't that something?
parade.
96 miles long in Arizona.
And also the other thing about Trump, if you go back and look at his interviews with Ronna Barrett and all these newscasters 40 years ago, they always asked him if he was going to run for president, and he always had it in his mind. So he knows he's always kept up with what country did this, what country did that, because it's always been in his mind to run for president. He always said, if the country got bad enough, I would. He said, I hope someone else will do it, but if they don't, the country gets bad enough, I will. And he said that 40 years ago.
Isn't that
So
interesting?
he's not just some Johnny-come-lately. And he might have been rich, but he didn't drink, he didn't do drugs. He's kept it plain.
It's highly unusual. You just don't see that anymore. Well, our thought for the day is from Psalms chapter 118. It's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. And it's better to trust in the Lord than put confidence in princes or presidents or governments.
General George Patton, one of my favorite generals. I'm not sure where he ended up, but I think God used him, regardless of his filthy mouth. He got things done just like Trump did.
Yeah, General Patton was an interesting guy, to say the least. Okay, now we're going to move on with Joel, maybe kind of quick here. I'm going to read through the first two chapters without a whole lot of commentary, but the commentary comes at the end. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Ha-eretz, the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it. Tell your children, and let your children tell theirs. What the chewing locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust has left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust has left, the consuming locust has eaten. Now, this word for locust, it may be a stretch, but that word may apply to destructive forces as well as locusts. And just kind of hold that thought for a moment or two. And awake, you drunkards, and weep and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it has been cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. This nation, once again, the Hebrew words allow a lot of interpretation for it. This can mean a collection of things. It can even mean a herd of things. The Hebrew word is gallery, and it, and particularly in this passage, it leads us to believe we're not talking about a nation of people, but a nation of something. And it's coming up against the land strong without number. Teeth are like the teeth of a lion. Typically, people don't have teeth like a lion. and he has fangs of a fierce lion. He has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped bare and thrown it away, and the branches are made white. Whatever this thing is that's coming doesn't sound like people. They typically don't eat branches and tear things apart like that. Lament like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. The field is wasted. The land mourns. The grain is ruined. The new wine's dried up and the oil fails. If you're an invading army, this is not what you do to the land. You kill off the people and you take the land and the produce of it and keep it for yourself.
That's right.
So why is this army destroying the grain, the ground, and everything else? Doesn't seem to follow. Be ashamed, you farmers, wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the fields has perished. Whatever this army is, it destroyed the grain of the field. If you're an invading army, you typically don't destroy the grain of the field. You take it and eat it, right? So the vine is dried up, the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate tree, the palm also, the apple tree. The trees of the field are withered. Surely joy has withered away from the sons of men. Gird yourselves and lament, you priests. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, you who minister to my God, for the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Wow, doesn't sound like good times. Consecrate a fast. Call a sacred assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Alas for the day of the Lord is at hand, and it shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Well, now we understand. This is not just an army of men. This is an army of something else. Something bad is coming, and it's coming from the Lord. It's not the food, huh?
It could be locusts then, huh?
Oh, it could be locusts.
Yes, okay.
But if you look at it, we'll find out later, locusts typically don't set fire to the land.
Okay.
Okay, is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness in the house of our Lord? The seed shrivels under the clods. What does this imply? No rain. Storehouses are in shambles. Barns are broken down. The grain has withered. Well, the army usually doesn't suck up all the water from the ground, does it? So we're talking about some other mechanism here. How the animals groan. Herds of cattle are restless because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep suffer punishment. O Lord, to you I cry out. For fire has devoured the open pastures, and a flame has burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field also cry out to you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the open pastures. So, hey, if this is an army of men, this is really bizarre. Their behavior doesn't seem to follow what men would do. You just typically don't come in and burn the whole place down. I guess you could, but it doesn't stand the test of logic, in my estimation. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. The day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people come, great and strong. This word for people can be a collection of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be people in the Hebrew. It could be a herd. It could just be the word is just used in certain occasions as a collection of things. So this collection of things is coming. It's great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor ever will be, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. So whatever this thing is, it is something that has not been experienced before. And we know the result of it. It's going to destroy the land. It's going to kill off all the crops. It's going to burn the place down. There's not going to be anything left. It's going to take up the water. There's not going to be any water left. The ground is going to turn hard, like in my backyard. The fire devours before them, and behind them the flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds so they run. A noise like chariots over the mountain tops they leap, like the noise of a flaming fire that devours the stubble, like a strong people set in battle array. This is predicting that however this thing comes, it comes like in a line, in a formation, and it's moving forward, and everything behind them is on fire. Everything in front of them looks like the Garden of Eden. This is not an army. This is something else.
Right.
And in my estimation, this could mean a meteor strike, a meteor shower, but if it were, I think they would characterize it a little differently, because that's stones hitting the ground. I'm sure that that Joel would have mentioned that if that's what he saw. Before them the people writhe in pain, all faces are drained of color. They run like mighty men. They climb up the wall like mighty men of war. Everyone marches in formation. They do not break ranks. This is implying that these are people. I don't think so. This is something else.
Exactly.
They do not push one another. Everyone marches in his own column. They lunge between the weapons. They are not cut down. They run to and fro in the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them. Oh, this is not an army of men. The heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark. Well, if the sun and moon are growing dark, that's not an army that causes that.
Could be a meteorite.
It's something else. And the stars diminish their brightness. The Lord gives voice before his army. For his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can endure it? Well, we've read the day of the Lord in the Revelation account. There are meteor strikes. Many of them are mentioned. And there's fire, there's confusion, there is just about everything you can imagine. But I think, well, there are demons that come out of the pit that look like locusts, right?
That's right.
Now therefore, says the Lord, turn to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and with mourning, to rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness. He relents from doing harm. Who knows if he will turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God? Who knows? Maybe he will relent and leave a blessing behind him. I think those are good words for us this day. Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and nursing babes, and let the bridegroom go out from his chamber and the bride from her dressing room. Let the priests who minister to the Lord weep between the porch and the altar, and let them say, spare your people, O Lord, and do not give your heritage to reproach, that the nations should rule over them. Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? Then the Lord will be zealous for his land and pity his people. And the Lord will answer and say to his people, behold, I will send you grain and new wine and oil, and you will be satisfied by them, and I will no longer make you a reproach among the nations. But I will remove far away from you the northern army, whatever this northern army is, and I will drive him away into a barren and desolate land. With his face towards the eastern sea and his back towards the western sea, his stench will come up and the foul odor will rise because he has done monstrous things. This northern army may be an army. it sounds like we're treating it like an army of people, doesn't it? Yes.
But Magog, that's supposed to be Russia, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a candidate for it. I got reasons why I don't think it is, but we'll see. Remember, the Seleucid portion of Alexander the Great's kingdom is north of Jerusalem, so it constitutes a northern army. Then the Lord will be zealous for his land and pity his people, and the Lord will answer his people and say, behold, I will send you grain. Did I just get through reading this one?
Yeah.
There. And the threshing floor will be full of wheat, and the vats will overflow with new wine and oil. So I will restore to you the years of the swarming locust has eaten, and the crawling locust, the consuming locust, and the chewing locust, my great army which I sent among you. If you read the Revelation account, I can't think of a single place in there where it mentions a consuming locust horde that did anything. The things that happen in the Revelation account are generally things of either a geophysical nature, like earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, every island being moved out of its place, earthquakes, and meteor strikes for sure. So this great army of the Lord apparently is something that's coming from the heavens, but it's also a part of the inherent nature of the planet also.
What about comets? Aren't they a fallen star?
Comets are a unique type of meteor. They are not really, well, you could argue that if they hit the Earth's atmosphere, there's not a lot of difference, except generally a comet is full of gaseous material and water, frozen water and stuff, rather than solid material like rocks and iron.
So we haven't been hit by a comet, most likely, right?
We were hit with one back in 1917 in Tunguska, Russia.
Wow.
And it leveled about 300 square miles of area. And there was no meteor crater because it blew up in the atmosphere because it was made out of mostly water. That was a big mystery as to what it was. And so they pretty much figured out it was probably a comet. Okay, you will eat plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who dealt wondrously with you, and the people shall never be put to shame. Then you will know that I am in the midst of Israel, and I am the Lord your God, and there is no other. My people shall never be put to shame, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. Anybody here have dreams? Dreaming dreams? Okay. You see, these old men like me, we dream dreams, I guess.
Some are bad.
Yeah, most of mine are pretty scary.
Yeah, right.
And also my men servants and my maid servants, I will pour out my spirit in those days. Now we're getting to the good part. And I will show wonders in heaven and in earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. That before, you got to watch that word when it's translated before. What does before mean? In our language, when we say before, that means in front of, right? In this instance, before means along with. It's not before it happens, it's before it in the sense that it's opening up in the presence of. So, just to make that slight clarification there. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls. And I will show wonders in heaven and in earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke. And the sun will be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the coming great and awesome day of the Lord. And I think I got this in there twice too.
Yep.
Okay. Now for the good part. Next week. Just kidding.
Well, I'm not going to hear your version of what remnants mean.
Okay, here's the story. Back in 1945, a guy by the name of Maynard E. White, Major Maynard E. White, led an expedition to the Arctic. And the reason that they went there, it's right after World War II. They had to know where the North Pole was because all of their navigation was tied to it. And it seemed to move around. They wanted to understand where the North Pole was. So they went up there and performed a mission. And he wrote a book about it. And all of the book is pretty much boring, except for the internal 3 chapters. And those 3 chapters blew everybody's mind. This is where they were. They were around the Arctic Ocean. And what they found was, when they did a core sample into the Arctic tundra, they found evidence that for the last 72,000 years, every 12,000 years, the North Pole flipped. It moved to the equator. And then 12,000 years later, it moved back.
Huh.
They were at a loss for what they were seeing here. They all thought they were losing their minds. But they looked at the evidence, and there it was. It was irrefutable evidence. They took this evidence to, at that time, the predecessor of the CIA. And they had a meeting in Washington. It scared them so bad that they classified all of the information. They didn't want this to get out. And the reason they didn't want it to get out was because every 12,000 years, the poles flip, and it causes a catastrophe on planet Earth. They found jumbled bones all together. The mastodons that were found frozen in Siberia, that was the equator 12,000 years ago. And if it happened 12,000 years ago, and every 12,000 years for the previous 72,000, we're up to the time when we're about to have another pole flip. It scared the pajabbers out of them. They immediately instituted in, I believe, well, I won't get ahead of myself here. Here's what they noticed. The poles now are moving. They're moving rapidly. Here is the center one here in the blue. That's the North Pole. And that's how far it's moved from 1600. And it's moving rapidly now. The South Pole is no longer over the ice cap. It's out over the ocean. They're both moving to the same place. This is bizarre. You see over here on the right, you see the arrows pointing? They're all pointing to a different polar location. They're moving there really quick. So this also scared the pajabbers out of everybody for the last several hundred years. So the Central Intelligence Agency was created on July 26, 1947, not necessarily to spy on our enemies, but to make sure that the scientific community didn't find out what was going on. Now, this took the place of the Office of Strategic Services, which had previously had some intelligence activities for the military. But they had to figure out a way to keep this information out of your hands. So they also founded a group called the National Science Foundation. If you look it up in the Wikipedia, it says it's an independent agency of the United States government. It is not independent. It reports to the CIA. Every paper that gets federal funding and guidance, which means you get published, has to be approved by the National Science Foundation. And if you get too close to the truth, they will not fund your paper. That's how they've been able to control this all these years. So my point is this, we see right now evidence of how corrupt our government has been. We thought we were living with a government that was righteous and truthful. They have been corrupt from the very beginning.
Greed, power, and money.
So the National Science Foundation was established in 1950, like I said, shortly after the CIA. This was their mechanism of keeping the facts from the American people. What they couldn't figure out was, they knew the poles flipped, but they couldn't figure out how that happened. And finally, a guy named Charles Hapgood, who was a CIA aficionado, came up with the theory that the crust of the Earth does the shifting, not the core, that the crust just breaks loose and shifts over the core of the planet. And that's what's happening. It's not the actual planet is turning, it just the crust is turning. And they thought that was a wonderful thing, but even Einstein, who was called in to figure out what was going on, he couldn't figure out what broke loose the crust. There was just no mechanism that they could think of. But of course, they didn't know about micronovas, because what they discovered was that the initiating mechanism that broke the crust loose was a micronova. We have always been taught that when the sun novas, it blows the sun all to pieces and it's all gone. Boom. Well, that isn't what happens. What actually happens is, and we have a whole list of them here in the Milky Way galaxy, of recurrent novas. They periodically go into a nova condition, which means they blow the outer shell of their sun off. It's an explosion. It's a nuclear explosion of some kind. Nobody understands exactly why, but they theorize that these suns that are doing that, when they do it, they almost always have in their company a binary star that's feeding material into it. It's being sucked out of it. So it's sucked into the heliosphere of the sun, and after it reaches a certain critical mass, just like uranium, when it reaches a critical mass, what happens? It blows up. Well, apparently that's what happens here. And these things do this in a regular pattern. Well, what they found out was our sun is doing the same thing. Back in 1957, after we figured all of this out, we, the CIA, figured all this out, they had this pajabber scared out of them. Because in 1957, the sun, which previously had only seen 20 or most 30 sunspots at any one time, it had 503 sunspots. It was blowing off material like you won't believe. We had the Aurora Borealis was seen clear down into Oklahoma, because I remember seeing it in 1957. I thought that was the neatest thing I ever saw. Well, it scared them to death. They knew they couldn't do anything about it, but they wanted to learn when, after it didn't blow up. They thought sure it was going to go into a nova, but it didn't. So after that, they instituted the International Geophysical Year, and if you'll notice the stamps back in those days, I remember this stamp, by the way. It shows the United States Geophysical Year. Remember Michelangelo's portrait where he has Adam's hand reaching up toward the hand of God? This is a symbol of what they thought. Here you've got the sun in the background, and this hand reaching up to God is, God help us, because we don't know what we're doing. We're going to get killed here, and we don't understand it. So what they decided to do was they instituted NASA in July of 1958. The purpose of NASA wasn't just to explore outer space, but it was to explore the moon and to determine if they could figure out anything about this recurrent micronova on the face of the moon. So they sent astronauts up there with specific instructions. If what they thought happened, we would see all over the moon's surface glass beads. Because when the sun micronovas, it melts silicon and makes little beads out of it, and it shoots off of the surface at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and it penetrates everything in its path. And some of the things that are blown off of the sun are planet-sized, 300 miles in diameter. Others are just grains of sand. Others are just micrometeorites. They blow through the solar system, and anything in its path gets whacked. This is one of the stones that they found on the moon. It is vitrified. It's glassy, in other words. But you see the holes in it? The first micronova vitrified it. The second micronova just hit it like a bunch of shotgun shells. And because there's no atmosphere there, all these pellets that are coming out of the sun just sprayed the whole surface of the moon. The dirt and the powder that's on the moon, that's where it came from. It came from solar micronovas. They didn't bother to tell you that, did they? Here's what it looks like. The sun blows up, and what happens is it leaves the sun, which is 93 million miles away, and it takes about 8.3 minutes for it to get to the Earth. And when it gets to the Earth, it is so intense, and you've heard me say this on other occasions, that it vaporizes the ocean. Whichever side of the Earth is facing the ocean, it gets vaporized. And any person that happens to be out in its surface in that area, they get vaporized too. And what happens is all of this water, and it sucks down about 1,000 feet of ocean water and blows it up into the atmosphere. At the same time, the Earth is twisting over on its axis, and all of the events mentioned in Joel come to pass. Here, after that blast of heat comes off, here comes the dust shell. It propagates off of the sun at about 1,000,000 miles an hour, so it takes about 93 hours for it to reach the Earth. But when as it leaves the sun becomes dark. You can't see through the dust shell, it's so thick. As places in the scripture report that there was darkness for 3 days and 3 nights and things of that nature, this is why. Because it takes for about 3 days for this dust shell to get to planet Earth. And when it gets here, it just whacks everything. And it looks something like that just before it gets here. It's not homogeneous. If you could get a little or you can get a lot, depending on where you happen to be. And then all of that material that's blasted out goes out into the far reaches of the solar system where it reaches equilibrium and stops. And before, they told you that the Kuiper Belt was the remnant material of the formation of the solar system. It's not. It's every time our sun goes in through a micronova, you end up with more material out there in the Kuiper Belt. So now we understand where the Kuiper Belt came from. But what was the trigger mechanism? Yes?
I thought you were saying, like last year that the nova was just the outer crust of the sun blowing up and stuff.
It is the material that is collected in the outer parts of the sun's atmosphere that apparently over time, if you get enough material in there, it will go nuclear. It'll blow up by virtue of the fact that, well, uranium blows up. Apparently you can reach a critical mass in there, and we don't really understand why it happens. But one of the things we have noticed is that these stars that have recurrent novas always have a binary associated with them. That means another sun that's orbiting around that sun. Well, do we have a binary? Yeah, we do. It's called Nibiru, and it comes about once in 12,000 years. It will make at least 4 orbits. So every 4th orbit of Nibiru, the sun goes into a micronova. Well, guess what? Nibiru is on the way. Isn't this amazing? Nibiru is showing up at the same time we're expecting a micronova out of the sun and a pole flip.
Does the sun disappear eventually?
It disappears temporarily as the dust shell moves outward into the solar system. The sun is not destroyed. We used to think any time that a sun went through a nova condition, it blew itself all to pieces. Well, it doesn't. when you get these micronovas, if you want to call them, or you can call them a super flare, just the outer atmosphere of the sun blows off, not the sun itself. It's still perfectly fine. But here's something that tends to make me believe that this is the way God is going to work this whole thing out. The fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire, solar micronova. And the men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which had power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. And then the fifth angel poured out his vial on the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness. And they gnawed their tongues for pain. You see what happens? They get burnt first. Here comes the initial electromagnetic wave as it leaves the sun. Both electromagnetic and light as it leaves the sun burns men. Gets here in 8 1/3 minutes. Then what happens behind it? Darkness for 3 days or thereabouts as the dust shell propagates out. And then what happens? The sixth angel, water is dried up. What happens when this heat hits planet Earth? If it hits the ocean, it vaporizes 1,000 feet of the water of the ocean, and anything that's in the landmass, it's going to vaporize that water right out of the ground. The water gets dried up, and then 3 days later, what happens? There fell upon men great hail out of heaven. Every stone weighed about a talent, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague thereof was exceedingly great. Here you have with the dust shell chunks of iron and metal and stuff coming out of the sky, hitting men and killing them. And then it says that the weight of it was about 100 pounds. So we got junk coming out of the sky. This can either be coming from Nibiru, or it can most likely be coming from the dust shell of the sun when it goes micronova. And that is my story on Joel, and I will 1 minute over.
That's your story and you're sticking with it.
Yep, yes, sir.
Oh, I was thinking, we talked about the locusts, destroying the land, and a comet, wouldn't that do the same thing and destroy the land as it burst out without hitting the earth? Wouldn't that destroy the land and the water with it?
When the Tunguska event occurred, it knocked down trees for about 300 miles around and killed several herds of reindeer. But fortunately, there was only a few people in the region, and they got burned, by the way, but they weren't killed.
It could have been 2 comets too, If 2 comets hit it, destroying more property than that, so.
Yeah.
But we're thinking it's a nova, not comets or meteorites, right?
Based on what we know about things now, it's going to be a micronova. It's due, number one. Isn't this amazing how God works? Everything is coming due at the same time. We're getting Nibiru closing in. We're getting evidence of a pole shift, which is concurrent with the micronova, because that takes the energy from the micronova to break the crust loose so that we can have a pole shift. I mean, all of these bad things are coming together at the same time.
But you're not talking about tomorrow, you're talking about years.
We don't know.
That's right.
That's what I was.
But I can tell you this,
Time frame, yeah.
this occurs during the day of the Lord. You won't be here. You don't have to worry about it. I'm just saying that this is typically the way God works. When the Jews left Egyptian captivity, it was the last orbit of Nibiru. All of the events associated with the plagues of Egypt can be attributed to the passing of Nibiru. The column of smoke during the day and the column of fire at night, that was Nibiru in the sky. And not only did the Israelites report it, all of the nations in the region reported it. And when the manna fell out of heaven, it fell all over the world. And it's reported all over the world also. Where do you think the Greek word ambrosia came from? So, any questions? I had to throw this out because this is a way, and I'm not saying it's the only way, but this looks like the way God works in history.
But
he doesn't necessarily just make a miracle. Well, in a sense, this is a miracle because all these things are coming together at the same time. But he designed this from the foundations of the universe.
Could that destroy the whole earth, you think?
Well, no.
Okay.
What happens is,
We're gonna have no more rain, we're gonna have to do this again, right?
as soon as the nova is only going to affect half of the Earth, the half that's facing the sun. It's going to blow the water up. That part's going to affect the whole world, and then all of that moisture is going to plate out. Snow on the poles. We'll go into another ice age, unless the Lord has other ideas.
Right.
But then we will probably what's going to happen is for 1,000 years we're not going to see the sun directly anymore.
Wow.
Remember when the Garden of Eden was in vogue? There's every evidence that Adam didn't see the sun. It was covered by a mist. A vapor canopy was over the planet. And that's why the temperature was so regulated, because with all that water in the atmosphere, you didn't get any differential heating. It was all spread all over the planet, and that's one of the reasons why you had a Garden of Eden. So this may be the mechanism which returns the Garden of Eden, which the Jewish rabbis and sages
How
have
could you survive
indicated.
with no sun, though?
Huh?
How could you survive with no sun?
Well, enough light gets through.
Okay, okay.
You know, it's going to look like twilight, but there will probably be no direct sunlight
Okay.
in the temperate zone of the planet. Just my thoughts.
Thank you, Joy, for providing
Oh,
facts.
thank
Yes.
you.
Yes.
Okay, it says the Euphrates will dry up. Has it dried up yet?
Do what?
It says Euphrates will dry up to make way for the kings from the east.
Yeah.
Has it dried up? And
Nope.
who are the kings of the east?
The kings of the East, in my estimation, is China. And the drying up of the Euphrates right now is even possible because they put a dam on the thing. They can close off the dam and dry up the Euphrates overnight. It may be a micronova that dries it all up, because if it hits in that region, well, it's sure going to dry everything up. Every body of water and bake the land down no telling how many feet.